Okay, sorry the last video ended abruptly, but I was leaving you with a question about the paradox of hedonism, whether we have to accept the first two premises. And then I accidentally uh, stopped the video recording. So we'll start up here where we left off. And now you've had a moment to think about it. Right? Are those first two premises ones that we have any reason to accept? If not, we don't have to accept the conclusion. So let's go back to the slideshow. And as Schaefer-Landau points out, the first premise, while it may seem plausible, is not one that we have to accept. Just because happiness is the only thing that directly makes us better off, we don't have to conclude that it's rational to single-mindedly pursue it. So we can reject the first premise without rejecting hedonism. And one thing to say about the paradox of hedonism is, it's useful for the hedonist in a way. It helps the hedonist clarify to herself that even though happiness is all that matters, right, we have to focus on other things, right? It's not rational to single-mindedly pursue happiness, even though ultimately it is all that matters, right? And that's a coherent thought. And so at least Schaefer-Landau believes the paradox of hedonism, while it raises a puzzle, it doesn't give us a reason to reject the basic thesis, okay? Let's look at a couple other examples, and I'll let you go through the rest on your own. The evil pleasures objection. And here you can think of the Bundy example in Chris Heathwood's essay, where we have the example of someone who thrives by doing evil things, or he thinks of himself as thriving, or he thinks of his happiness as somehow depending on successfully doing evil things. Anyway, so this is a potential problem for the hedonist. And again, we've got the argument broken down into its skeleton form. It seems like the hedonist is committed to the first premise, that if happiness is all that really matters, then happiness that comes from evil deeds is as good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. So you can think of two different people. They both claim to be happy, but one, right, is going around and stealing and from other people, and his happiness depends on his wronging others. Whereas the other person goes around and helps other people, and his happiness comes from his benevolent, compassionate attitude and his good deeds that he does for others. And it seems like hedonism is committed to the view that, well, if happiness is all that matters, it doesn't really matter ultimately where it comes from or what causes it, or whether it stems from good deeds or evil deeds. But the second premise then says that, well, it does matter, right? Happiness that comes from evil deeds is not as good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. Come on, we all know that, right? That's the second premise. And again, it has the form of denying the consequent in the conditional statement in premise one. So it's the same form of an argument. If P, then Q, but not Q, so we have to reject P, right? The antecedent. We have to reject the claim that hedonism is true. Okay, is this a good argument? Schaefer-Landau thinks it's not. And he thinks the problem with the argument is that it trades on two different senses of good, right? And he doesn't think that the hedonist is committed to saying that happiness that comes from evil deeds is just as morally good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. If we interpret it that way, then that's a problem for hedonism, right? So everything hinges on how we interpret the word good. If we define good as morally good, then the hedonist is committed to a fallacy, right? It's not true that happiness that comes from evil deeds is just as morally good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions, right? So, okay. But if by good the hedonist just means contributes to, a person's welfare, makes it the case that a person's life goes better on his own terms, if we don't interpret good to mean morally good, then it's not as much of a problem for hedonism, right? And so the hedonist can sort of reject premise two, right? As long as we don't define good as morally good, the hedonist can reject premise two. Okay, so that's the point here about argument is, your premises depend on the truth and falsity of your premises, depend on how you define the central terms. So if you define good as morally good, that might make the premise true. But if you define it just in terms of individual welfare, I just mean a person's own good, then it makes the premise false. Okay, so depending upon how you define the central term, that determines the truth value of the claim. That's an important instructive thought about how to analyze arguments. Okay. Similarly, we can say something similar about the two worlds objection. I mean, this is an interesting case. Imagine two worlds. They have equal amounts of happiness, but in one of the worlds, people live not only happily, but freely and equally, right? There's more freedom and there's more equality, right? So in world A, there's more freedom and equality than there is in world B, but both worlds have the same amount of happiness. It seems like the hedonist is committed to the view that those two worlds are equally good, but we want to say they're not equally good, right? A world that is both happy and free and equal is better than a world that just has a lot of that has the same amount of happiness in it, but less freedom and less equality. Again, right, Schaefer-Landau thinks that we don't have to accept the first premise. While it's true that some situations are, that these two worlds are not equally good from a moral standpoint, the hedonist is not talking about situations or worlds. The hedonist is making a claim about lives, right? Two different lives are equally beneficial if they achieve the same amount of happiness. The hedonist is not, Schaefer-Landau thinks, committed to a view about what makes a world good or bad, but just to a view about what makes a life go well or badly. And those are two very different claims. So again, depending upon how you clarify, right, what the hedonist is actually claiming, right, this argument can be seen as a good or a bad objection. If you really think the hedonist is making a claim about what makes a world good, then it's a problem for the hedonist. But if you deny that and say, no, the hedonist is just making a claim about what makes a life good, then the argument is no longer a problem. Okay, now, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is it matters how you define your terms, and it matters, what you think the central or basic thesis is really committing you to. And depending upon how you interpret that, that will determine how good or bad the argument is that you're considering. Okay. There are these other examples that he works through, and I thought you could think about this on your own at home. The false happiness argument is interesting. Here the thought is that the hedonist is committed to the view that our lives go well to the extent that we're happy. Okay, again, that's just a restatement of the basic thesis. We can ask what it means, and in analyzing what it means, right, we might be able to avoid some of the objections to it. But the second premise, it's not the case that our lives go well to the extent that we are happy, right? A denial of that claim. Why? Because those whose happiness is based on false beliefs have worse lives than those whose happiness is based on true beliefs, even if both lives are equally happy. So here, we're not making the mistake of the two worlds objection. The hedonist is definitely committed to a view about what makes a life go well. And the view is that, that happiness determines how well your life is going. So if you have two lives that are equally happy, then they're going equally well. The hedonist does seem committed to that claim. And the problem is that some people's happiness depends on false beliefs, right? So I might be happy on the assumption, I believe that let's say my spouse loves me, and my happiness depends on the love of my spouse. But if that turns out to be a false belief, and I found that out, if I found out that my spouse didn't really love me, then my happiness would be undermined. But so long as I don't come to terms with that, so long as I continue to operate under the false assumption, I can continue to be happy, but my life's not going as well as it would be if it really were the case that my spouse loved me. And an indication of this is when I find out, right, that she doesn't love me, I become miserable. And so the thought is that a person's life is going better, whether their life is going well doesn't depend just on the amount of happiness that they enjoy, but whether their happiness is based on a true belief or a false belief. Again, okay, so that's the premise. And if we accept that premise, it seems like hedonism is false because it suggests that there's a measure of whether a person's life is going well that seems independent of happiness, right? Just whether they are living in contact with reality or not. It seems to be an independent measure of a person's well-being. And that seems like a potential problem for the hedonist. So do we have reason to accept or reject the second premise? Everything hinges on that. Okay. So you can work through this on your own. I don't want to spend too much more time working through the rest of the arguments. Notice that some of the arguments are ones that Schaefer-Landau thinks are stronger than others. So, for example, when he gets to the idea of autonomy, freedom, seems to be something that we value independently of happiness. And I think he believes it's hard to explain the value of autonomy purely in terms of its contribution to happiness, because sometimes we end up choosing freedom over happiness, for example. The very last one, the hedonist seems to be committed to the view that the only thing that can really harm me is sadness. So the suggestion being, if I just adopt a positive attitude toward all of the bad things that happen in my life, that my life is going well. Right? So even if I lose all my friends, if I adopt a positive attitude toward that and remain cheerful and happy, then my life is going well as it would have if my friends were still my friends. But the thought is that some things can harm you even if they don't directly cause you to be sad. And the other part of it is, the attitude of positivity doesn't all by itself raise the quality of your life, right? Other things have to be true in order for the quality of your life to be raised. A positive attitude, he thinks, is not enough. Again, but that's an argument. So he considers various reasons for accepting that conclusion of that argument. And that's something for you to think about on your own. Okay, I hope this was useful, and I will see you tomorrow.